Well, hello and welcome to the All Saints podcast. By popular demand, I'm back here again with my friend and fellow pastor, Geoff Shaw. And we've got a question that came in from one of the members of the congregation a few weeks ago, which I want to take the opportunity to talk about with Geoff. I hope you're okay with this, Geoff. Just throwing you a bit in front of a microphone here. Are we ready to go?
We're ready, I hope.
So here's a question. So this came in by email, and let me say just at this stage, keep these coming. It's very helpful, and really the primary purpose of this podcast is to just find another way for us to reach out to and to keep the teaching coming towards you guys at All Saints. Of course, we know that there are people out there who aren't at All Saints who are listening, and you are most welcome as well. But this came from somebody at All Saints. I have a question for you, Pastor Jeffery. This has been a developing question over a number of weeks and comes from conversations, observations. And we recently watched a documentary on the Duggars and their troubles. And if you don't know who the Duggars are, then, okay, you have my permission just this once to Google it. Anyway, the question is how we are to think of family planning and birth control. I've heard in my past the extremes, like the Duggars, where the argument would be that, and quote, something like this: children are a blessing. Blessed is the man who has his quiver full of them, which means that as a married couple, you just have as many children as you can, and you trust God with your family planning. In fact, in some of these Christian sub-communities, part of the marriage vows would be a pledge not to use any birth control and to try and have as large a family as you can. I'm not asking this about families that just want big families and are able to do that. The question continues. I'm asking more for people that in either out of some sense of piety feel they're obliged to have as many children as they biologically can, or think that it would be ungodly to use contraception or something like that. What does the Bible say about this whole cluster of issues? And frankly, I suspect there are quite a lot of people who are at some point in the future here at All Saints and further afield, obviously, going to be faced with questions like this. Some of the rhetoric in our Christian community speaks of birth control as unholy birth control, and is that something we want to say about all forms of contraception and so on? So I think I'm just going to put this over here. Maybe we should just start by laying some foundations and just think through what the scripture says about children and marriage and the purpose of marriage and family life, and then just we'll build from there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's great. Foundational first, right?
Yeah. So kick us off. Your thoughts, Geoff.
Yeah.
The easy one. What does the Bible say about children, and how should we think about a married couple wanting to have kids, and seeing children as a blessing? So,
yeah. First of all, they are a blessing, right? I mean, that's not in doubt, and I think that children, certainly, I mean, children are a significant part of marriage. They come along with marriage. They should be the expected norm as a blessing to married families. That said, I don't think that people are obliged to have as many children as possible. That would be an extreme view in my estimation. Right. That we, and obviously as we get into this, when we talk about birth control, we're going to be talking about a complex issue, right? Because there's all types of birth control as a really kind of broad heading that could even pertain to abortifacients and and such. But
there's a whole spectrum.
Here, right? But I mean, it's as old as the hills in terms of people saying I don't want to have another child, and there's some natural ways.
There's some natural ways of not having children, right?
Right.
I mean, I just think it might be helpful for us to dwell for a second or two on the positive, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
And the places people always think of, rightly, Psalm 127. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Then Psalm 128, you've got the picture of a blessed wife is a fruitful wife whose children are like olive shoots around the table. And like last time I checked, olive trees put out many shoots. They're kind of bushy trees.
Yeah.
And I guess part of what I want to emphasize when we're thinking about children is, from a biblical standpoint and a theological standpoint, this is not just a kind of isolated thing, right? Children and family life in general is the means by which God shows his grace to his people. So Genesis 1, fill and subdue the earth. That's the way that you experience the ongoing blessing of participating in God's plan for the world. Even after the fall, God promises to bless his children and his children's children.
Right.
Under the older covenants in the days of Abraham and Moses and David, under the new covenant on the day of Pentecost. And this is familiar to those of you who, certainly like most at All Saints, will be paedo-baptist in theology. Peter exhorted people to bring their children to be baptized. Repent and be baptized, all of you, and you'll receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, for the promises for you and for your children. And so it's not just that here's your Christian life, and one of the things you should do is have children if you're married and you're able to do so. Though that's true, it's more than that. It's that the blessing of family life is a principal means by which God fulfills his purposes down through the generations. And to see children in that incredibly positive way is really a mindset we need to get to grips with, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I had this conversation with a missionary recently, right, about evangelism and I mean, filling the earth with Christians as well, right? Yeah. And certainly evangelism has its place. We should all be involved in evangelism, but I really believe also we're going to populate the earth with Christians via families, via Christian families.
And we don't want to dichotomize the two, right?
No, not at all.
Missionaries.
Absolutely.
You mentioned last Sunday, immense rates of conversion in the country of Iran and China. And praise God for that. Yep. And at the same time, why do we have to choose between covenant faithfulness in families and evangelism to people who've never heard of Jesus and don't know the Bible's got two testaments, right? We've got to be able to do both, right? And in our culture, that is an increasingly, what should we say? Let's be gentle about it. That's an increasingly minority standpoint, right? Yeah. In a broader secular culture.
Right. People are saying children are kind of a burden, right? That we need to plan them so that we can really plan the rest of our lives, so that we can make our priorities and not have them crimp our style.
Right. And that's really what's in the planning your family thing, isn't it? It's not so much I want to plan my family. It's I want to plan my life and do all the stuff that I want to do that children would get in the way of. And then we'll try and find a way to squeeze children in and among the really significant priorities that I've got.
Right.
And that is something which I guess it's snuck up on us especially since the advent of modern contraceptive
60s.
technology, since the 60s. The contraceptive pill, we'll talk about that. So we have, it's astonishing if you think about it, although maybe it's not so astonishing if you know more about the kind of cultural background to it, how quickly we've gotten to a position where the assumptions about what your life as a couple will look like have just flipped so rapidly. So we've gone from a married couple who would naturally expect to start having children, within, a year or two, if the Lord gave them the ability to have kids, to it's completely normal for both husband and wife to be pursuing their careers, which is normally the thing they want to do, into their mid-30s, delaying marriage for a start, and living together with no intention of having children and maybe not getting married, but the kind of the cohabiting and then marriage extend for a decade or two. And in some cases, people choosing that rather than children. I mean, and that's really quite common. I was listening to a podcast just the other day, and somebody who's a married woman who they just chose not to have kids.
Right. And I think I would take it so far as to say if you did encounter people who said, well, we're married, but we don't want to have kids, say, well, at least I would want to probe. Why do you not want to have kids? You know, children are a blessing. Children are not meant to be seen as a burden.
Right. So, and this, we now start to move towards the sharp edges of this ethical question that the email is really asking. Because I think we could say with a degree of certainty that there are plenty of ways of saying we don't want to have children
Mm-hmm.
that are just sinful insofar as they are standing against God's plan for our lives.
Right.
Now, of course, we all gravitate towards the exceptions here. I've known people who, not just that they weren't able to have children biologically, but in one or perhaps two cases, they had a kind of medical conditions which could seriously imperil their health if they had a child, or somebody who's had one child, and her life would be in grave danger if she were to conceive again.
Yep.
And that's, we're not messing around at that point. But those are rare, but they're not unknown.
Right.
And I think one of the challenges for us as a church is to recognize that and to avoid being judgmental.
Yes.
So you see people with different sized families, and it's easy for the enthusiasts among us to kind of arrange them in a hierarchy of maturity and godliness that roughly corresponds to their number of kids, and that would be a mistake.
Right.
Because honestly, other people's medical concerns are not my business or anybody else's, and
we don't not have all the facts most of the time. This reminds me of just earlier today, I was discussing something with Mrs. Loki, and I was just kind of saying something a little too matter of fact, and she kind of cooled it off a little bit by adding some more information. I thought, I didn't think of that. I didn't.
So so one of the marks of our community will be, I think, if we're growing in maturity as Christians, it will be an ability to talk about these things in a way which genuinely does give moral guidance, but is not prematurely judgmental.
Sure.
Right. So
what is it? Frames ethics?
Is perspectives. Yes. But everyone's situation and everyone's experience is different.
Yeah.
That said, Pastor Neil was just in here a minute or two ago, and his comment was, well, some people build their doctrine of salvation on the thief on the cross. Some people build their doctrine of children on Sarah, the wife of Abraham. In other words, we don't want to build a general case from the exceptions.
Right.
So let's try and get specific about some really practical things. So children are a blessing from the Lord. More than that, they are a means by which God chooses to bring about his purposes. And it has to be said, you look at the created world, you look at the way that men and women interact, and they get married, and they share sexual intimacy. That results in children, right?
Yep.
So we've got an argument here.
Some of the time.
Right. Well, this is an interesting thing. So what's intriguing about this argument is there's a way of framing the argument that this email is responding to, which is actually a form of a natural law argument.
Yeah.
And it's worth maybe we take a minute or two to explain what that is, and then you tell me what you think.
Yeah.
So the natural law argument in general will go, here is the structure of created reality. We can read off that moral norms that apply to us generally. We're not going to the scriptures for our moral norms. We're going to the created order. We're observing that when you have a man and a woman and they get married and they share sexual intimacy, they have children. Ergo, anything that gets in the way of that is getting in the way of what God has designed. You ought not to put anything in the way of that.
Right.
And that's how you end up at the kind of position that this email is articulating. And you sowed the seed of one of my responses. I mean, okay, look, let's give it its due, right? It is the case that God has made it so that a man and a woman, if they have sex, will have children eventually.
Yes.
Probably most of the time.
Which is what makes it wrong if you approach marriage as, it is normative to have children. So if you say, just put it out of your mind, we don't want to have children, that may be wrong, because that there is a normative.
Right. But the reason why it's wrong is because of how Scripture speaks about that.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I mean, at one level, I want to pick up the comment you made, like some of the time, that if we make that natural law argument, it's a really bad natural law argument.
Because only some of the time do we conceive, right?
Because how many weeks, how many days in a month is a woman fertile? Maybe 3, 4, and therefore, depending on how long the sperm live inside her body, maybe you've got 25%, or it depends on the peculiarities of people's biology. But one roughly on average 1 day in 4 or 1 day in 3
Mm-hmm.
is possible for sex to result in conception. And even then, it doesn't always happen in those periods of time. So if you wanted to make the argument from natural law, then you'd have to make it with that in mind.
Yeah.
That God has designed this expression of love and intimacy specifically so that most of the time it doesn't result in conception.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sitting here saying children are a blessing from the Lord. It would be a bad thing for a couple not to want to have children. But at the same time, I'm wanting to say, let's not follow that way of arguing. And actually, let's not
It's not
have
the whole reason we have
Right.
sexual relations.
Right.
Right.
And so let's dispense with the whole natural law thing.
Yeah.
As a way of doing ethics, because it's flawed for all kinds of other reasons. And just consider the scriptures. We have scriptures which clearly indicate the blessing of children.
Mm-hmm.
You've also got the Song of Songs, where children don't really seem to be top on the list of what the lady is excited
They're not in
about.
the picture at all.
Right? It's just like, and so let's relax a little bit about what sex is for. Let's feel free to affirm all that the Bible affirms about it.
Yep.
Let's feel free to affirm that it is given for pleasure, mutual sharing of pleasure, as well as for procreation.
Sure, absolutely.
And we're not going to dispense with either. And the danger here, can you almost hear it? You can almost hear the people who want to emphasize one side or the other.
Sure.
Feeling like wanting to say, yeah, but, and I want to say yes to both groups of people.
Yeah.
We're absolutely going to affirm what Scripture affirms by this. So where does this take us then? Does it put us on this sort of hard to navigate spectrum, where at one end of the spectrum, you've got people who say, I just don't want to have kids.
Yeah.
And we're saying that's wrong. And the other end of the spectrum, we're saying anything you did to prevent conception,
that's also wrong.
That's also wrong.
Right.
And it would be, look, if you use a calendar honestly, right?
That's
contraception, because if you've got those 4 days, that the wife knows that she's fertile, and if the husband is paying attention, and he knows that there's this whole 2-week period where they could have sex and they couldn't have a child if they tried. God has designed things like that. And are we supposed to pretend that we don't know that?
Right.
So
the ancients knew that.
So you've got this end spectrum in the middle. What do you want to say about the different places that you could occupy on that spectrum, Jeff?
Yeah. I want to say, first of all, I don't think that, okay, so we're not making complete statements here, just initial statements, building something. So I would say, first of all, that I don't think natural contraception is wrong. I mean, I think, again, if a family I have a pretty full quiver, and I'm a pretty, I'm growing older. I don't know if everyone knows this, but I had my first child at 40.
Right.
And I had a baby. I didn't have a baby. My wife had a baby when I was 52.
Right.
So,
she's a few years younger than you.
Yeah, she is a few years younger than me.
We're not now disclosing.
But let me put it this way. Right. Well, she's quite a bit younger than I am. But when we were dating, getting ready to get married, and we talked about, how many kids, and I remember she said 5, and it about blew my mind because I was 38. Right. And I thought, this isn't,
sticking, Jeff.
I mean, this isn't going to happen, right? 5. Good luck with that, And we have 6.
Yes.
So that's pretty amazing. So, but that said, I'm in the position of like, wow, another child I'd be heavy, Yes. So I'm living this. I mean, we're having a discussion about
your youngest is 2, right?
2. Yeah. 2. Well, going on 3 in September.
Right. Okay.
So I mean, to have another child, I'm sure Brianne feels this way too. It would be pretty heavy.
Well, can we talk about that then? Because this is one of the things where I think people who are trying to navigate this in a godly way, they're thinking about different forms of contraception, and we'll come to that in maybe in a few minutes' time and talk about, because we're not here going to write a blank check for any kind of form of contraception and any extended use of it and so on. But the people who are trying to navigate this in a godly way, they're not
Mm-hmm.
making the obvious mistakes that we have indicated and we will indicate more of. But you get to a certain point and you want to say, do you think it's ever reasonable to say, I think we've reached a point where something like we can't handle anymore, or it wouldn't be wise for us to try for any more, even though we biologically can? Is there anything that there are dangers with that? Maybe we want to articulate the dangers with it as well as what might be reasonable about it. Do you want to pick one of those? What's reasonable, or what would be dangerous and ungodly about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is you can be stretched so far that you can be overwhelmed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when you have a full quiver, the idea of just saying we're not going to concern ourselves with this whatsoever is not to live in the real world that God has put you in, I think.
Yeah.
So, you know, that said, again, the devil's in the details. So we're going to have to get into some of these real, the different types of contraception that you.
Well, I wonder. I think you've got a whole bunch of things already, just in what you said. Before we get to the methods of contraception, the details of what somebody might mean if they said, "We're feeling pretty stretched."
Yeah.
Right. Because let's be honest, there's a way of saying we're feeling pretty stretched, which really amounts to, it would be inconvenient for us to have a second.
Yeah.
Because, we've adopted a certain lifestyle and a certain number of expensive holidays every year and vacations.
Right.
And we want to put our little darling through Harvard, and we know what the fees are. And these things are really important to us. And therefore, we've done the math and we realize we can't afford. So it will just be a bit too much for us.
Yeah. Right? That's different than, say, entering your 40s.
Yeah.
And being at a higher risk for complications,
right.
Difficulties, having had a couple of difficult pregnancies that you brought, you've had a child through, but they've been more difficult each time.
Right.
There are very real instances where women, their last child is handicapped, disabled, whatever you want to call it, right? Needs. Right. So some sort of special needs. So, these are all circumstances which I think are not the same. Obviously, they're not the same as, well, a second child, we wouldn't be able to take that vacation to Hawaii each year.
And it's this point where the significant criteria that individual couples have to really acknowledge first and then process become harder to discern from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another point where really I want to urge all of us to be very, very slow to rush to judgment. In fact, not to rush to judgment at all.
Yeah.
Because we just don't have the relevant information. I mean, we certainly don't know that we would have in every case.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if we're trying to give guidance to people, it's actually quite easy to sketch the ludicrous extremes where you say, obviously the person who really is just thinking about how they can have this extremely prosperous and affluent and moneyed lifestyle, and a second child would get in the way. That's not, this is too much for us.
That's just selfish.
Right? But somebody who says, who's had a child that has special educational needs or some physical disability, and actually what you want to do is to care as much as you can for the children you have,
right? And
your ability to do that really would be meaningfully compromised by having another pregnancy and child and then a young baby. That seems to me a reasonable thing to say. I feel like there's 90% in the middle, and where actually the truth is that the thing that starts to enter your head is, I don't feel like I'm mature enough, organized enough, competent enough, together enough as a Christian to do this.
Yeah.
And well, that might be true. The solution might not be stop having kids. The solution might be to trust God for your growth and maturity. I mean, what this really does, if you flip it around, and remember where we started, Psalm 127, with this, children are a blessing from the Lord. I've spent some time recently encouraging young men in particular to take seriously the growth in maturity that's needed of them, the aiming to be able to provide well financially and in every other way for their family, so that they can enjoy the blessing of children, and so that they can set their wife free from the daily concern about where the next meal is coming from for the growing family. Let's flip it around that way, and while acknowledging that we all have a breaking point and we all have limits of various kinds, also acknowledging we don't really know where they are. God can stretch us. That's and we can grow.
Yeah, right.
And we should be trying to grow. Like our aim ought to be the kind of men and women who could raise godly children in increasing number as the Lord gives them to us. Right?
I was recently having a conversation with someone, keep it pretty vague, but I was getting the sense that they felt a tad bit overwhelmed, where they where they are with all of their young children, and yet I think that person's attitude still was, if another comes, it will be a blessing, though I think they don't desire another one right now. So I think that's perfectly fine. They should feel no guilt over that. Children are a blessing. They have a lot of blessing. And
let's just imagine some more kind of textured differences. I think it's perfectly possible to imagine people who, let's suppose you have a clunk of children quite close together. You feel somewhat overwhelmed. You think maybe we've reached a limit. Maybe you're wrong about that. And maybe you turn around 10 years or 11 years down the line and you look back and think, well, I wonder if we could have, you could try again. At this point, you also raise the whole question of adoption. And adoption is not just for people who can't have children of their own. This is something I've talked about once or twice in the last couple of years, but we probably ought to talk about more, because it ought to be more of a live reality for us as a church, I think. And we all grow up in strange ways, and there may be people out there listening to this who, you made your decisions as a couple about how many children you wanted to have when you were in your 20s and 30s, and then maybe you had some kind of surgical intervention to make it impossible to have any more. But now you're 45 and you're thinking, your views have changed. Your perspective on children has changed. You're more in line with the Bible, frankly. And
45 is young to be raising children. Let me tell you.
and you may have grown up in the faith. You may be a better dad now and a better mum now than you were. And yet biological children are not going to be in your future, not more biological children. Well, there are how many, I don't know, or eye-watering numbers of children out there who are in desperate need of adoption. So why not at least consider that? I want to say that. Let's touch on a couple of other issues. There's the methods of contraception thing. You mentioned that. The obvious no-nos.
The day after pill. And I would say anything that's an abortifacient that has been chemically, and I think a lot of people actually don't know this. And so I do think it's worth, I think every married couple ought to do its research. It's a good thing to be educated in this realm. And some of the pills don't do what they market themselves to do. They don't just keep eggs from being fertilized. Sometimes they keep fertilized eggs from being implanted. That is what's known as a silent abortion, if you will. We don't want to be promoting that kind of industry that kind of practice. So,
I mean, and that's an ethical distinction of some significance. So a method of contraception that stops fertilization from taking place because the egg and the sperm don't have the chance to meet is potentially ethically legitimate, within the constraints that we were talking about previously, where your goal is to have a family, and you're not thinking of children as this kind of slightly unfortunate side effect of being married, where you really want to pursue your other goals, is potentially legitimate morally. So that we're not in the same place as the Roman Catholic Church at this point, would, because of the natural law argument.
And I will add, I'll throw in there too, you say potentially ethically or morally legitimate. I say the other factor is conscience. So, you know, and this is an area where I want to say, I think that people do need to, it's not that I'm saying abortifacients need to be a matter of conscience. No. But if you're engaging in contraception that you don't have peace over, I think you should not be using that type of contraception.
The conscience argument definitely works that way.
Yeah.
So in ethics, we all have an obligation to follow our conscience, which is to say we should do what we think is right.
Right.
We also have an obligation to educate our conscience.
Yes.
But the doctrine of, to put it simply, play it safe. Like, if you're not sure,
right,
don't do something that you think might be sinful when there's another option.
Right. So I mean, I'll give an example of something I think is, not all Christians, not all good Christians in our circles are going to agree on.
Right.
But to get a vasectomy, right, as a method of contraception, if you will.
Yes.
I don't think that is something that I'm not prepared here today to say that's wrong or yes, that's acceptable.
Right.
I think that very much can be an issue of conscience.
Right. Well, and it could be the kind of thing which depends not just on where a person is in terms of their own thinking about it, because there's the formal material sin distinction that you're alluding to, but it's the other circumstances. So if the reason you're having a vasectomy is because your wife has been told if she gets pregnant again, she could die, which is actually the situation that a friend of mine in the UK was in. That's a very different thing from other circumstances. So again, we're in that realm of it's complicated. It depends on the specific circumstances. But just to back up a couple of steps, I mean, your comment about people not being aware of the potentially abortifacient effects of hormonal contraceptives, contraceptive pills.
Right.
A lot of them can work in multiple ways, and we're not doctors, or at least not that kind of doctor. Go and consult your physician and check whether it's possible that a pill that you might be considering taking can work by preventing implantation of a fertilized ovum. Because if it can, then that's actually doing is terminating the life of a child. They'll call it a fertilized ovum, but it's a child. And the difficulty here is that the statistics might be invoked. It might be the case that in 99.9% of cases, what happens is that fertilization doesn't take place because the contraceptive works by preventing ovulation, or in some other way, by preventing contact between the sperm and the egg. But if that means that there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that you take this pill and in a particular month you're terminating the life of a child. Would you take a risk of 1 in 1,000?
No.
Right. No, none of us would.
Right.
So put like that. Yeah. So I'm totally with you. The range of options we're really kind of narrowing down.
Yeah.
We want to start from a position of saying children are a blessing. Marriage ought to be oriented towards this. Men ought to be thinking, how can I set myself up by God's grace so that I'm best able to provide for a wife and a family that's growing? Both men and women should be thinking, how can I become the most godly version of myself so that I'm able to be a great mum to lots of kids, and should be trusting God for that growth in godliness. And then we start to recognize, it's not unreasonable to seek to use methods that are not morally objectionable in themselves, like a calendar or like condoms or some other method that doesn't introduce the danger of abortifacient effects.
Right.
It's not illegitimate to consider those approaches within those broader parameters.
Right.
And then I just want to come back again and restate at the end, let's not have a conversation about how to stop having kids. Right? Let's not turn this into a conversation about birth control. right? Let's have a conversation about how to orient our lives in the way that we are participating most fully in God's plan to give life to others. And I think that's the spirit in which I want to engage with this. Now, where that actually leaves us is a million miles from the kinds of exaggerated and extreme subcultures that you may have seen in the mainstream media, right? I mean, we don't need to go into the details of that. We're not here to beat people up over those things, but we're a very long way from that. But what we do want to be is a community of Christians that is oriented towards life. We're thinking of the children are a blessing from the Lord, and we ought to be striving to move in that direction. And at the same time, you'll look around you at church. Look! One of your pastors has six children. One has 3. One has 2. So, not just for my sake, but for the sake of other people who may have made choices, the details of which are not known to everybody. Let's not become judgmental about one another, because otherwise we could easily end up coming to blows. Because
it is really a matter of know thyself, isn't it? I mean, as a culture, I'm very excited to be in the CREC and be a part of a culture where you see a lot of big families and where we affirm the blessings that children are. I think where we need to be careful is to grow proud of that, and like you said earlier, judgmental, being careful not to be judgmental over that. So, but
very good. Any final thoughts for us, Pastor Shaw?
No, this has been interesting. Thank you. Can we don't mention who sent in the question. We don't mention
people get to ask their questions.
Well, thank you for sending in that question. I know who you are. Thank you.
No, it's great. It's great. So just final word for me. Thank you for the question. Please send any more in that you'd like to. Remember, we know this gets shared, and sometimes we have like famous and eminent pastors and theologians like my guest today, Pastor Shaw, and the episodes get shared far and wide, and that's great. Share this with your friends if you think people would benefit from it. We do want to be a blessing to the church, but we're here primarily for you guys. This is about All Saints, and so if you have questions that you want to share with us, please don't hesitate, ping them our way, and who knows, your question might make it on here, and certainly if it doesn't, we'll come back to you anyway and try and give you the benefit of our thoughts about it. But I think that'll do us for now. The Lord bless you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for bless. Bye for now.